Hey there team, my name is John and welcome back to the channel. Welcome to another video. Welcome to another life-changing message. We are moving right along in our series, All Things New, where we are walking through Ephesians chapter 2. It's not a spoken word poem, I promise. And we're talking about how we can experience true newness this year. Okay, maybe it is a poem. But before we talk about now, I actually want to start by bringing some of you back to your childhood. So how many of you out there read Dr. Seuss as a kid? For me, I loved Dr. Seuss. Green Eggs and Ham, How the Grinch Stole Christmas, even The Lorax. But my absolute favorite Dr. Seuss book was a little-known story called Sneetches on Beaches. Snitches get stitches? Sneetches on Beaches is this story about these made-up creatures called Sneetches. And some Sneetches have these stars on their bellies, and then there are other Sneetches that have no stars or no design on their bellies at all. And it's this really wonderful story about how the star-bellied Sneetches think they're better than the plain-bellied Sneetches. It's really wonderful. Which naturally brings us to Ephesians chapter 2. Ephesians chapter 2 verse 11 says, "Therefore, remember that formerly you who were Gentiles by birth and called uncircumcised by those who call themselves the circumcision, which is done in the body by human hands, remember that at that time you were separate from Christ and excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world." So there are two groups of people that we have to know who they are in order to really understand what is going on in these verses. Our first group is the Jews. Now, in the Bible, the Jewish people are God's chosen, beloved people. Most of the Old Testament tells the story of this Jewish people. These were the Israelites, the nation that was promised through Abraham, the people who suffered in slavery in Egypt, and Moses set them free, and they wandered in the desert waiting for the promised land. King David, the temple, exile in Babylon, the whole thing is about the Jews. And so for thousands of years before this, and in the time that Paul is writing this letter, it was generally believed that only the Jewish people were God's chosen people. Only the Jewish people had access to God's favor and his love. And there were many different ways that Jews would sort of mark themselves as set apart as God's people. And one of those ways, all the way back again from the Old Testament, was a process of circumcision. One of the most physical and obvious signs that someone was Jewish was whether they were circumcised or not. Jewish males were circumcised at birth by tradition. Wait a second, why is that obvious? Just got a bunch of Jewish people walking around with their pants off? Well, yes. Kind of. It's important to remember that in this very Roman culture that Paul is writing to, things like gymnasiums and Roman baths were very, very popular. There was a lot of focus on the beauty and the power of the physical human form in this culture. And so it was not uncommon in that time for you to find yourself in a situation where your circumcision, or lack thereof, was quite apparent to everybody. I know, it's weird, we don't really walk around like that anymore, or at least I hope you don't. The important thing to note here was that circumcision was a sign that Jews were in and everyone else was out. Who was everyone else? Well, that brings us to our second group, the Gentiles. Gentile is sort of a biblical catch-all term for anyone who is not Jewish. And obviously, anyone who is not Jewish would not be circumcised, which, as we know in this culture, was a pretty obvious marker, kind of like not having a star on your belly. Did he just equate circumcision with a Dr. Seuss story? Now, there was a huge debate going on in the church in Paul's day surrounding the specific role of Gentiles. In the first century, the message and way of Jesus was spreading far and wide, and there were Gentiles who were responding to it and beginning to believe in the God of Israel. And the Jewish people had to start asking themselves, what are we supposed to do with these Gentiles? I mean, They're not Jewish, so they can't possibly belong. And so many believers in the first century church were continuing to draw lines in the sand over heritage or marks of who's in versus who's out. Then Paul steps in. Well, actually, Jesus stepped in and Paul points it out. In verse 13, Paul writes, "But now, in Christ Jesus, you who once were far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ." I don't want to overstate this, but this is a pretty big deal. Paul is saying here that this faith that we're talking about is no longer a conversation about who's in or who's out. But in Jesus, every single person has a chance to come near to God and to experience his blessing and his grace and his love and everything that once was only reserved for the Jewish people. Paul's claim here, very simply, is that in Jesus, the left out are led in. The crazy, sort of audacious and progressive thing that Jesus did with his ministry is he took the in crowd and the outcasts and he put them into one family. So what does this mean for us here today? Well, a few things. First, this is good news for any of you out there who have ever felt like an outcast. Maybe you have been told, either explicitly or implicitly, that you could never belong in a religious environment. Maybe every time you walk into a church, you kind of feel like a plain-bellied sneetch amidst a bunch of proud, haughty, star-bellied sneetches. Maybe you've been told that because of your past mistakes, or because of a certain aspect of your upbringing, or your family's economic status, or your sexuality, that you actually have no place with God. But what I want you to know today, and what I want you to be encouraged by, is that according to Paul, all of those people who told you that, they're wrong. According to Paul, according to the Bible, those dividing lines have been erased. All of the ways that we continually try and separate people from people and people from God, none of those are valid for those who have said yes to Jesus. The good news is that regardless of who you are, regardless of what symbol is or is not on your belly, you have a new identity in Jesus. And this is also a convicting and challenging word for those of us who are still drawing lines in the sand. And so many of us do this. We draw lines between Democrat and Republican, and we really struggle to see how anyone in the other party could call themselves a Christian. We draw lines in the church over contemporary versus classic worship. And we sort of look at that other expression and think, oh, our way is the true way of doing church. We draw lines over good Christian behavior and bad earthly behavior. And we sort of harshly judge and talk about people at our school or people we work with who say or do things that we don't agree with. And we act like we're somehow better than they are. But the reality that Jesus has brought in is one that says each and every person has a place in this new family of God. Even the people you don't like, even the people you disagree with, even the people you don't think should be included. The challenge is that just like you have been given a new identity, so have they. So to all of you who are watching this video right now, remember that regardless of where you're from, what you've done, or who you may think you are, regardless of whether you have a star belly or a plain belly, you are a sneetch of God. Or a child. You get it. Hey friends, thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, please give it a like and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We come out with new messages each and every week. We're now halfway through this series, All Things New. If you're enjoying it, please leave a little comment. Also, I wanted to let you know, if you are perhaps looking for more resources, more ways that you can perhaps grow in your faith or move forward in your faith journey, I have a monthly email list where I put 3 to 5 books that I have been reading that have have been helping me move forward in my faith journey. A lot of those books inspire a lot of the teaching that I do, both here on my channel and on my podcast, The Johncast. If you're interested maybe in getting some of those resources, these are all resources that I have read and enjoyed and been encouraged by myself. If you're interested in perhaps just getting one email a month with some of those resources, you can click the link in the description and you can sign up for my monthly reading list. I really think you'll enjoy it. I really think it will encourage you. As for now, that's all I have this week. I will see you all next week right here on the channel for part 4 of All Things New. I love you all. Keep being awesome.